Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to have with us two outstanding professionals in the area of refugee resettlement and dealing with the refugee problem. Dan Hanniher is field director of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and Erol Kekic is the senior vice president of programs at Church World Service. Both the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service and CWS, Church World Service, are two of the 9 agencies that are approved by the United States government for resettling refugees. Gentlemen, welcome. I'd like to start us off for a second. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen and show a slide that kind of gives us a little bit of an contemporary overview of the refugee situation in the world. As you can see, the UN estimates that there are about 82.4 million people around the world who have been forcibly displaced. We think of that as generating 26.4 million refugees, but there are another 48 million people who are displaced internally within their own country. Only a small percentage of those people are actually seeking asylum in a formal sense outside of their own country, 4.1 million people. And now, this, of course, was before the Ukraine situation, probably before the Afghan exit of the U.S. government. How much worse is it today than it was 2 years ago, for the data shown on that slide? Guys, go for it.
Erol, I'll defer to your expertise.
Erol, you want to start us off?
Sure, be happy to. Many thanks, Dan. That's very kind of you. Much worse, in short. We have seen the aftermath of the United States pull out of Afghanistan, generating those chaotic scenes of evacuation from the Kabul airport and subsequent exodus from the country for those who were able to leave. So we don't really necessarily have a very good grip on the numbers of people that have moved out of Afghanistan at this point in time, but we can say that we have successfully resettled jointly with all of our partners and other agencies about 80,000 Afghans into the United States over the last 7 months, and with more on the way. The conflict in Ukraine has already, as of today, displaced more than 2.8 million refugees and potentially up to 7 million internally displaced individuals. This does not account for people who can't leave inside of those surrounded cities. And that's just the last 2 conflicts. Let's not forget the ongoing protracted situations that continue to push people out of their homes.
I would add 2 circumstances that beyond conflict have impacted all of this work so significantly, and that's COVID, in that it shut down the process in almost every conflict area. Circuit rides, for instance, by the United States State Department, ground to a halt for 2 years. So the pipeline of refugees has significantly narrowed, along with the actions of the previous administration in simply turning their back somewhat on refugee resettlement. So there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built out once again, and that's complicating factors around these ongoing conflicts.
Has there been an increase in the pipeline into the U.S.? So has the government on an emergency basis said, hey, let's increase our capacity to take refugees, or has that not been dealt with yet?
The Biden administration has come into the office changing the official number of people to be admitted to the United States through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program from 15,000 under the last president to 125,000. But because of the reasons that Dan just mentioned, and a number of other issues, we have not been able to see a significant increase in numbers of people actually arriving. This is if you don't take into consideration the fact that we have, for the last 7 months, been really busy trying to deal with a large number of Afghan guests that have been evacuated to the United States. So the number of 125,000 is still in effect for fiscal year 22, which ends in September of this year. And thus far, we have admitted a very modest number of refugees, and it's very unlikely that we would be able to reach nowhere near the overall number of 125,000. Now, the 80,000 figure of Afghans that have arrived does not count against that number, that ceiling or that target. And that is because Afghans have largely been admitted under a different legal status of that of humanitarian parole, which is different from that of a refugee. And while that might sound like a technicality, it is in effect changing people's lives, because once admitted as a refugee, person has a pathway to permanent protection, from adjustment of status that they're eligible for in 1 year after arrival, to permanent residency, to applying for asylum or for citizenship in 5 years after arrival, provided they're in good standing if you are admitted as a refugee. Also comes with full benefits in terms of being eligible to apply for local and state benefits in locations where they are. If you want to contrast that with the benefits available to the Afghan population who's been admitted under the humanitarian parole status, you will notice that there's no permanent way to protection, and they have to apply for asylum in order to be able to achieve that, which is in and of itself a process that takes time, energy, and not to mention money in legal representation. And the absence of an Afghan Adjustment Act that we have been advocating for, pretty much a vast majority of the number of people that we have resettled will be in a place where they have to apply for asylum.
But what about, I mean, obviously on everyone's mind is the Ukraine situation. Are we remotely ready to accept any significant number of Ukrainians? And has that been discussed at all in either of your organizations?
It's certainly being discussed. Again, I run an office on the ground doing the reception and placement work, so I'm not necessarily in the league of voices that are debating how and when this might all transpire. But my understanding is that it likely is still a ways off, despite the fact that we very well could manage a significant number of Ukrainians. But the State Department and the United Nations, when they look at significant distance movement of migration, generally wait for the declaration of a protracted conflict. And we're obviously not at that point yet with Ukraine, and God willing that something will occur and perhaps peace will be restored and people can go home rather than have to traverse across the globe.
Well, Erol, you have people on the ground. I was just wondering what maybe you could report to us, to our listeners. Is this going to metastasize into something major, or will it just stay basically a European problem?
Well, I think it could obviously metastasize depending on actions over the next few weeks. And what we are seeing, we saw Ukrainians arrive over the weekend in Fargo, but they're not in a refugee program. They already had passports and had a visa and had a family waiting to receive them here. So people are trickling, but I think the decision making is at agency level with the State Department plotting a course forward, and Erol probably has more insight than I would.
Erol?
Well, I think that firstly, if I knew the answer to what will happen next, I probably should be working for someone else, and I don't. We can certainly see a number of scenarios that could potentially materialize. There's a good difference that we have documented in a way that this population has been treated, as opposed to many other populations that have sought refugee protection in Europe and elsewhere. and good for Ukrainians that they are able to access protection. The European Union has issued a protection decree that basically gives people a period of time and freedom to move freely around the EU member states and settle where they feel appropriate. This is not typical. This is not what normally happens. This is not documented in most other refugee situations. So good that that is happening. We think that the way that this conflict has erupted and enveloped thus far has generated a lot of support for people of Ukraine, and rightfully so. And I think that that goodwill is still very much a display throughout local and international media. The question of numbers is a strange one, and I think plays over time, because the more people cross the border, the less goodwill ends up being on the other side of that border. And at some point in time or another, we feared that the saturation that has been already described in some statements by foreign leaders, including the president of Poland, is slowly but surely settling in. I think everybody's pretty much aware that this is not going to end overnight. And the question of what happens to people after a while is alive and well. As Dan rightfully pointed out, the US has and will continue to resettle Ukrainians. We have a standing program that is cautiously still operational, even though they have to operate in the middle of conflict, and are trying to find solutions to that issue by working out of neighboring states. But the US refugee admissions program is not, at this point in time, an emergency vehicle. It's a huge ship that takes time to move and turn around. And I think it will be probably a decent amount of time between now and the moment where we see some more significant numbers coming out of that part of the world. That said, I would not be surprised at all if this week or next we hear that the US government decides to create a designation of, quote unquote, P2 status for Ukrainians, just because that is a mechanism to offer to those who have family members in the United States to still arrive here, or those who have specifically urgent protection in other cases to qualify for potential consideration. But the process that we undergo as part of the USRAP takes years.
Well, and yet, what happens to programs like the Syrian resettlement program while these other ones go on? Is it, I mean, there's just, I would presume, a limited bandwidth to be able to handle applications, to be able to handle the physical movement of people, not to mention the difficulty now with, as you were mentioning earlier, Dan, COVID, and, and now the transportation of people around the conflict zone in Eastern Europe. How do you deal with all of that?
You could really see that happen with the Afghanistan crisis, in that a pause was placed on the normal reception and placement work that we do day in and day out. So there was very little travel from Africa and other parts of the Middle East so that we could manage the Afghan phase one. Now it's shifted, so we are receiving from those other areas of conflict now. But clearly, if Ukraine rises to the top, then that likely is going to set off some mechanisms that will cause others to be slowed down.
One of the questions that we've been interested in being here in California is, historically many refugees came to California. We live in Orange County, which is, sort of the center of the Vietnamese diaspora in the world today. Is there, when you're settling people, do you have to find places where people can afford to go? Like, we've read articles where they say, don't even think about California as a place to resettle refugees because it's too expensive. Is that true? And if so, what does that mean?
Well, it sure makes Fargo attractive to some people. In fact, last night was, we've organized with some dollars from the state, a mental health initiative for some of the Afghans, particularly the individual men who have resettled here. They're isolated. They probably got PTSD for years of service in their own military, the traumatic move through Kabul and out. So we're offering them opportunities to get together every Sunday to play soccer or volleyball together. And I was talking with a fellow last night that I had not met before, and he had come from San Diego. Here it's below zero. I said, why did you come here? And he said, well, the costs and the quietness. It's not as hurly-burly an atmosphere. It's a good, quiet community, affordable. There's housing, there's jobs, a lot of opportunity. So, but across the country, it's certainly going to vary. And California, particularly the Sacramento area, has just been overwhelmed with Afghans. Sacramento, the San Antonio area, Northern Virginia, they've all cut off any more Afghans coming. And so that creates opportunities for Fargo to welcome some more people. They may not like it at first, but even some go to Texas after a while, but then they come back because there are attributes to my community.
Erol, what are you finding?
Well, I think people tend to like to join their family and or pursue employment opportunities and other opportunities that are available to them in that order. And when we make a placement decision, we try to do so based on the best interest determination for that particular individual and or family. And if they do have a close family relationship in a location X, we try to accommodate that request at every opportunity we have, just because you can place people anywhere else, they'll pick up and leave the next day and go to join their family members. Frequently, we see that people spend some time with their family and then slowly but surely branch off, as we all do as humans, in pursuit of opportunity and happiness. But I think we are finding at this point in time that this reduction of capacity that took place under the previous administration has had significant impact on the capacity to raise to the occasion at this historic moment. And we're in dire need of expanding our ability to finish the job that we started with the Afghans, meaning that over 60% of our caseload amongst the 9 agencies is still in temporary housing. And it was just because of the emergency nature of this process here, meaning they're in hotel-like settings and we need to find permanent housing and move them there. But if you're in San Diego or in Sacramento, for that matter, where there just either isn't available housing or definitely not affordable housing, that creates long-term challenges for our local colleagues. And I think we're in the desperate need of expanding geographies beyond the areas that have been mentioned as impacted by refugee arrivals, to explore smaller communities and other communities that have not necessarily traditionally participated in these programs, but could certainly benefit from the energy, capacity, and goodwill that refugees bring into those communities.
So if I understand you correctly, a lot was disassembled under the Trump administration. A lot of the infrastructure that had been built up to handle the inflow of refugees was just basically terminated or disassembled. Is that right?
That is correct, in a very simple way. The overall numbers were reduced. The categories of people that were allowed to come in were changed to a place where there was simply no way of maintaining capacity of these local offices to continue to operate. And I will add that what played a role in that process is the fact that our system is outdated and needs upgrade. It needs that software upgrade, the 2.0, the 3.0, whatever it is at this point in time, to really be responsive to 21st century needs. And the way the system operates right now is based on a refugee arrival. So all of our local colleagues, and then Dan can talk about this way more than I can, basically have to do a lot of legwork, including finding appropriate housing and paying for it, including security deposit and the rest, before a refugee ever arrives. And basically, if something changes at the last minute and person does not arrive, you're out that money and you will not be reimbursed for it. And I think that created a very difficult existential questions for some of the local offices around the country. I don't have a pipeline. If I don't think the people will arrive, can I continue to maintain the capacity that we know we will need at one point in time? And the answer was unfortunately no in so many of these situations.
And so a lot of local field offices like yours, Dan, were disbanded. So what's been happening at the local level, like from your perspective in Fargo?
Well, that's a whole nother story and a whole nother hour of conversation, because the establishment of our LIRS office here is unique. It happened a year ago this week, following the closure of the state's largest nonprofit, Lutheran Social Services of North Dakota, closed its doors on January 15th. And
What timing?
200 people were out of work, including all the New American Services staff and myself included. We had a 4-hour notice that we were out of work, and we had refugee arrivals 2 nights prior. So we weren't about to quit. We all put our volunteer hats on and raised money and made sure that services continued to be provided to them. And LIRS, our national volunteer agency partner, came to the rescue. So we're a new experiment for one of these. Perhaps some of the others like CWS have their own agencies on the ground, but this was first time ever for LIRS to actually have a field office providing services to clients directly on the ground. And I am so fortunate, and I'm sure Erol could back me up on this, in that I've been able to maintain staff. They were out of work for a month or two. The state of North Dakota hired them on to do additional RSS, Refugee Support Service work, until I could hire them back. But they all came back. I've got a staff of 12 now that aren't paid a lot of money, considering the economy that we're in today. They have clients who are now making more money than they are.
Wow.
In manufacturing.
As newly arrived immigrants.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
I have a young woman who arrived in May of last year. Once she got her Social Security card, about 4 or 6 weeks later, she got a job, started at $18 an hour. After a 90-day probationary period, moved up to 20, full benefits, unlimited overtime. She's bringing home about $4,500 a month.
Wow. Wow. And Erol, at CWS, I know that there were, I just full disclosure, I am a former board member of CWS, so I have some insight into the organization. And I know that when the Trump administration came in, it was highly disruptive to the organization, especially in CWS's operations in Africa and other places outside the United States. Has that been rebuilt since the new administration has come in, or is the organization still operating with kind of a skeleton crew around the world?
We have been fortunate to maintain the basic capacity throughout the rough years, and have been able to slowly but surely rebuild, and we're largely ready for the response when the Afghanistan situation erupted. We have tried and continue to expand that capacity to new locations, and that includes both domestic and international locations, and have continued to build upon the foundation that existed before. It is our presence in Resettlement Support Center in Africa, for example, is at a growing pace at this point in time, and we look forward to easing of the COVID-related restrictions on travel, and we look forward to welcoming and hosting U.S. government officials whose presence is legally necessary on the ground to conduct interview with refugees who are potentially eligible for the resettlement into the United States. And that has been a slow rebuild process, despite our own capacity changing pretty dramatically and pretty quickly. And we continue to experience some delays on that front, in addition to experiencing delays in clearing people through the security clearance process, largely because we believe, since we don't have insight into that part of the government inner workings, a lot of people have been shifted onto the Afghanistan-related work, and that meant that other groups have really fallen off the priority list. We hope to see them come back.
Yeah, so here's my question, the big picture for both of you. You know, that chart that I showed in the beginning that basically pointed out about 24 million, and now it's probably up to about 30 million refugees, not even counting people who are displaced within their own country, but the 30 million refugees. Big number. US on a good day may take at most a couple of 100,000 of those people that are looking for resettlement somewhere. Is there somebody out there, another country that is doing it right, that is a model that we can adopt? Or is this just the nature of this work over time, that you just can't possibly solve the entire problem?
Well, I'll just offer that resettlement in and of itself is not the solution to the refugee crisis. Resettlement is part of the solution, but we can't possibly expect that every single person who is forcibly displaced and crossed an international border will be found in need of refugee protection and be in need of resettlement as a durable solution. And then thirdly, finding a spot for that person who can then go through the process. The US has been and will continue to be, I certainly hope, a leader in this field and offering protection to those who need it the most. That was decimated, as discussed, previously under Trump administration, and is being rebuilt at this point in time. But there are a number of other countries that participate in this process, and certainly our neighbors to the north come to mind. Dan probably sees them from his window a lot more than I do.
Not quite that close.
About an hour away.
They have certainly done it right, and they continue to do it right. And I think we have, as a community, learned a lot from their experience and continue to engage with them on a regular basis. Number of European countries have stepped forward over the last decade or so to take on their fair share of responsibility sharing for forcibly displaced. But I would go out on a limb and say that those programs are largely still nascent and not as developed as those that take place in Canada and the United States. And of course, Australia certainly takes another important spot in this ecosystem, despite some challenges within their own government relations and the way that they see refugee programs. And I think
right, and immigrants in general. I mean, the interesting thing about Canada and Australia, at least from a history perspective, is that these are countries that have always needed people. They've needed people to come in because they're such large geographies and relatively empty, and they needed to populate the country. With the low birth rate in the United States and in Western Europe, are countries starting to say, we actually need people too? Maybe taking more refugees would be a way to solve that problem. Is that discussion even happening?
I think it is. And for many years, I think refugee resettlement was one of those really nice hidden secrets of the United States and Canada, but very few other countries, in that it did aid in our overall economic development. I've always viewed and I've not been in this work for much more than a couple of years, so I'm still the young guy in the group. But I've always looked at it as a three-pronged stool, that obviously humanitarianism is foremost in the work that we do, but in the environment that we're working in right now, it won't cut it alone. And economic development is such an important factor for refugee resettlement. And it's not just in filling the jobs that we need filled today, but it provides an additional consumer base as well to buy those products that people are making. And here in North Dakota, that they're growing. And then the third one is national security interest. And I think that's highlighted well with the Afghanistan situation. We need a good refugee resettlement system in order to support the needs of our national security interests and getting our friends to safety. So I'm hoping, actually with Ukraine, I'm hoping that this might be an inflection point. You already talked about the fact that in particular, Europe is much more willing to welcome the Ukrainians than perhaps they were the Syrians or the Afghans or Somalis. It's a question of unknown fears, I think, but this might be an inflection point to make people think, well, if I'm so willing to welcome Ukrainians, why not those Syrians who were trying to cross the Mediterranean a couple of years ago? Let's rethink this, and maybe there are advantages to us bringing them as well.
Maybe what, as we try to put the big picture on and, put this all together, what does it mean for the United States and its image and its mission to continue to bring refugees in? What if we, under the Trump administration, which really is the first, I would say, actively anti-immigrant administration I've seen from either party from the time I've been covering this, which is far too long. So what does this mean for America? Not just economically, but in terms of what our mission is, who we are. After all, the people who broke one of the interesting things about North Dakota is actually at the time of its independence, it was much more heavily immigrant than almost any place in the country. How does this refugee process work in sort of defining what America is about? I'll leave you with that.
I'll note that the first mosque in North America is located in North Dakota, and it's still standing. So yeah, we have a lot of refugees. In my family being Irish, they weren't categorized as refugees, but they came here for the same reasons. And you all could probably tell similar stories, I'm guessing. Again, I think that that getting past the actions of the Trump administration, when I took this job a little over 2 years ago, I knew my predecessor was getting frequent hate mail, ugly emails, nasty phone calls. Our our president at Lutheran Social Services during a period of time had to have police outside of her home at night because of threats. So I came into this position thinking, I'm probably going to have to face some of that too. And in this 2 years of work, I've not had a single email, a single negative phone call. So maybe something good is coming out of the transformation back to the normalcy of regular refugee resettlement. I can only hope.
Erol, you have some thoughts about this?
You got the last word, Erol.
Well, I would say that being welcoming to refugees is fundamental to this experiment of ours called the United States. I think we have had an opportunity to be on the right side of history throughout the years and decades prior, and I hope that we'll continue to do so going forward. I can say that having traveled somewhat extensively and having been in conversations abroad, the overall thinking of this country and its people is positive. And people do want to believe that while there was this unfortunate blimp in our history, that will never repeat itself, because they knew that they can count on the United States to be on the side of the good, on the side of the right, on the side of the truth. And unfortunately, the 4 years that we have lived under have challenged that notion, and I think have exposed some cracks in our system. And I think, as Dan points out, the issue got politicized to a place where people were receiving threats just because they were seen as pro-immigrant and pro-refugee. We think that Afghanistan has changed it. It's brought together a lot of people of different backgrounds, including those with military backgrounds and academia and private businesses and others. And I think Ukraine is serving kind of the same same purpose, if you will, to solidify the fact that refugees are just people like you and I in search of international protection, and resettlement is just a tool of such protection. So if we can offer a safety and an opportunity to someone, then we should do that.
Well, these are great words, and hopefully we will be able to continue to try to live up to them as a society. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the Feudal Future podcast. This is just fascinating. I wish this were a problem that had an easier solution to it, but I'm delighted to see two really competent people thinking deeply about it. And Joel and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.